Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. President Lee Jae Myung has just wrapped up summit talks with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, marking a significant step towards Korea-India ties. The two sides agreed to restart negotiations on upgrading their SEPA trade pact, aiming to conclude talks by 2030 and signed 15 agreements by covering trade, energy, technology, and cultural cooperation. They also launched a new ministerial-level cooperation framework with plans to expand joint projects in shipbuilding, nuclear energy, and critical minerals, while stepping up collaboration in AI and advanced technologies. The latest visit comes as global supply chain risks continue to grow, and both countries look to position each other as key partners in production and resilience. For more on this, we are joined in the studio by Mason Ritchie, Professor of International Politics at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. A big welcome, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
And also joining us online is Hwan-Duk Cho, Assistant Professor of Indo-Pacific Studies at Korea National Diplomatic Academy. Good to see you, Professor Cho.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start our discussion with Professor Ritchie. So India's strategic weight in the Indo-Pacific is rising fast these days. For Korea, could you tell us what kind of partner is India today, and what does the latest visit actually mean?
Yeah, I think to be honest, I would say that India is a bit of an underperforming strategic partner. In fact, President Lee Jae Myung more or less said the same thing. And honestly, I think the Indians would probably say the same thing with respect to the Koreans. If we look back to the history of India in the post-Cold War period, they developed a strategy after the end of the Cold War called the Look East policy, where they were going to begin to focus more on Southeast Asia, China, but also Japan, Korea, and other countries in East Asia. That got some traction, but perhaps not as much as one would have expected. And then they developed a sort of successor policy to that in the 2000s called the Act East policy, which was meant to sort of turn some of those Look East policies into reality. But perhaps especially with Korea, that remains somewhat underdeveloped. And Korea shares its part of the blame too. The second leg of Lee Jae Myung's swing here after India is to Vietnam. And just by comparison, South Korea has more than 10,000 businesses registered in Vietnam, and it's less than 1,000 in India, although India is obviously a much larger country. So it's not just about India, it's also about South Korea. So taking that into consideration, I think what this visit by Lee Jae Myung means is that it's a chance to really relaunch in a time of turbulence an improvement to the strategic partnership going forward.
Right. So this underperforming, it kind of means there's a lot of room for improvement as well, right?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Now, when we build on this, Korea and India have been working closely based on their special strategic partnership, which was upgraded in 2015. Professor Cho, how would you assess the change in the level and depth of bilateral relations reflected in this summit?
Korea-India relationship has made a real and meaningful progress since it was elevated to special strategic partnership in 2015. Defense cooperation, particularly K9 Bajira, has become a genuine model of a joint production and technology sharing between the two countries. On the business side, if you look at major Korean companies like Hyundai, Samsung, LG, and POSCO have all deepened their presence in India, which reflects a real confidence in India's growth trajectory. That said, the overall scope of depth of cooperation has not yet fully matched the enormous potential of the relationship. There has been a persistent gap between the ambition of the partnership and the concrete outcomes on the ground. What makes this summit stand out is its substance. President Lee and Prime Minister Modi agreed to establish a brand new ministerial-level platform like the Industrial Cooperation Committee to coordinate on trade, investment, critical minerals, nuclear energy, and clean energy. They agreed to accelerate SEPA improvement negotiations and to upgrade the SME cooperation framework. These are not symbolic gestures. They are institutional building blocks. So President Lee himself framed it well. both countries are now entering a new decade of their special strategic partnership. And in a world of growth uncertainty, finding reliable partners for prosperity is more important than ever.
Right. So the summit could be a turning point in elevating the relationship to a more strategic level. Now, when we turn to one of the key issues, Professor Rishi, of course, the Middle East situation is developing day by day, and it's raising energy risks, of course, and energy cooperation was a key theme. Where can the two countries, South Korea and India, deliver real practical results?
Yeah, so the total trade balance between the two countries is something like $25 billion, which is of course not a huge amount. South Korea has a small, or I say reasonably sized surplus in that regard. But South Korea does receive a meaningful amount of its naphtha imports from India. India is the #5 naphtha exporter or importer into South Korea. After some of the Middle Eastern countries, Persian Gulf countries, by the way, and Algeria, I believe. Something like 8% of South Korea's naphtha comes in from India, and that naphtha is a feedstock that goes into industrial production of refined petrochemical products, which are then both used here but also exported abroad. And so South Korea has already indicated that it would like to see India step up its naphtha exports to South Korea. That might fill some of the gap from some of the problems with the energy imports, notably naphtha coming in from the blocked Strait of Hormuz. And then in the second place, diplomatically, India and South Korea should absolutely be working together along with a lot of other dependent countries who are in a difficult position to pressure both Iran and the United States to wrap up this conflict as quickly as possible and to assure safe navigation of energy supply ships, in fact, of all cargo ships through the Strait of Hormuz and into their markets in the rest of the world, including South Korea and India, obviously.
So energy cooperation seems to be at the heart of this partnership moving forward. Now, beyond that, strategic industry cooperation like shipbuilding, AI, and defense was also a major agenda item. Considering Korea's industrial structure and India's growth potential, Professor Cho, which sectors do you think offer the greatest synergy?
I think that all three sectors, shipbuilding, artificial intelligence, and defense, featured prominently in the summit outcomes, and each one carries, I think, a genuine potential. But if I had to identify the area where I expect the most immediate and tangible synergy, I would say shipbuilding. Here is the reasoning. India has set extraordinary ambitious maritime goals, becoming a top 10 shipbuilding nation by 2030 and a top 5 player by 2047. To support this, the Modi government has introduced the Shipbuilding Financial Assistance Policy and a Maritime Development Fund, and plans to build dedicated shipbuilding parks on both eastern and western coasts. These are backed by serious financial commitments and clear national priority. So at this summit, both governments agreed to combine Korean companies' advanced technologies with Indian central and local government support, such as facility construction assistance, guaranteed ship orders, and production subsidies. So HD Hyundai has already signed MOUs with the Cochin shipyard and with the Tamil Nadu state for a new shipyard. These are real investments moving forward. On the other side, on AI, I think two leaders agreed to build a digital bridge framework, pairing India's deep AI talent pool with the Korea's world-class AI infrastructure that has a strong long-term potential. In defense, I think the K9 bilateral partnership has already proven that joint production and technology transfer can work between our two countries.
Professor Cho, the two sides also agreed to expand cooperation in strategic industries, including defense and the arms sector, in particular, as India seeks to strengthen its own defense capabilities. How do you see the potential for Korea's defense industry to move beyond simple exports and become a strategic production partner in the Indian market?
Now, that's very important questions. India's defense sector is now undergoing a very fundamental structural transformation. And Korean companies need to recognize that the old model of simply exporting finished products is no longer adequate. Under the self-reliant India policy, the Indian government is aggressively pushing for domestic manufacturing, indigenization, technology transfer, and expanded private sector participation. So India is actively shifting from being a large import market toward becoming a manufacturing and export-oriented defense power in its own right. So the scale of ambition is striking. India's defense budget for 2026-27 has been set a record high, over $85 billion US dollars, up roughly 15% from the previous year. So defense production and exports have both hit historical high. So the government has set targets to grow defense production to around $33 billion and export to over $5 billion. So for Korean defense companies, the practical implication is clear. Winning in the Korea-India market now requires local assembly, technology transfer, and genuine participation in India's defense industrial ecosystem, not just the hardware delivery. So Korean firms should think in stage, starting with component supply, moving toward the joint development, then local assembly, and eventually integrated maintenance and logistics support.
So it could suggest the relationship could go beyond a simple trade into a deeper industrial cooperation moving forward. Now, when we look broader, Professor Ritchie, India is stressing strategic autonomy when it comes to the U.S.-China rivalry. Do you think that could create new opportunities for Korea as well?
Yeah, so it's really nothing new that India is emphasizing and stressing strategic autonomy. I mean, obviously that seems like it's maybe perhaps a more significant strategic line to take, given the state of the world. But there's essentially a history of India, buying weapons from both the U.S. and from Russia historically. But although, as Professor Cho said, its defense industry is in the process of changing. India buys hydrocarbons from both the U.S. and from Russia. India has a very complex relationship with China. And on top of that, India has a huge population, large land size, large market, nuclear weapons, diverse partners, a multi-alignment diplomatic line. So this strategic autonomy is nothing new. I think what's significant this time is that South Korea should be able to take advantage of that, and hopefully will be more willing to engage and meet with India, and hopefully India will also be able to sort of activate, as I mentioned earlier, that kind of Act East ethos, that Act East policy. Clearly, in terms of sort of short-term to medium-term deliverables, I think Professor Cho laid out exactly the scenario for what South Korea would see in terms of beginning to get extra market share in India. I think one of the important questions, of course, especially in the defense and security space, is where does South Korea want to be invested? Where does it want to have that technology transfer taking place? You don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs by giving away the technology that you're going to yourself need in order for your own exports. How are you going to do the licensing on those types of things? What is India going to expect? What is South Korea going to want to expect? But clearly there's a lot of upside there for South Korea. And also going the other direction, what can India offer South Korea, whether it be in optics, software development, AI development. India also has obviously this huge technology pool, especially on the human resources side of things. So I think that there's something to be gained there. And then, lastly, critical minerals. India's, starting to obviously need a lot more of those, for all of the reasons that other countries are too. Electrification, high tech, AI, and all that sort of thing. So, clearly there's some room for South Korea to perhaps get into India's ecosystem in that regard as well.
So definitely a lot of opportunities came up through this. Now, we are aware that a lot of a big number of business leaders accompanied President Lee during his visit to India. Beyond securing access to India's 1.4 billion consumer market, what does this actually mean for supply chains?
So for supply chains and some sort of general supply chain diversification and resilience, I think it's actually hard to say, to be honest with you. And I'm sorry, that's maybe kind of a cheap answer, but the short version of the story is India is a very tough market. It's very competitive. Frankly, it's kind of opaque. It's very relational. You don't just snap your fingers and overnight, turn on the switch on, how to diversify your supply chains with India as a partner. So I think that's going to take a while, and I think it's hard to say like what's going to come out of that. What I would say is, at least in terms of, sort of critical minerals and supply chain security and diversification, India has just recently passed a slate of laws that are dealing with this issue. And one of the things that's come out of this set of laws is India, of course, would like to diversify the partners that it has in exploration, analysis, modeling, in terms of geology, critical mineral resources, refining, technology and capacity, and those sorts of things. So again, there are certainly some niches where I think South Korea has some advantages on the tech side, and India as a large country with a very significant need for those critical mineral imports and discovery is going to perhaps want partners like South Korea who are going to be able to provide some services and become a partner in that area in some respects.
Now, when we talk about the institutional framework, one of the outcomes today, the two leaders also agreed to resume talks in May on upgrading the Korea-India Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or SEPA, and set a target of expanding bilateral trade to $50 billion by 2030. Professor Jo, what level of market opening or institutional reforms would be needed to achieve that kind of goal?
Yes, the Korea-India SEPA has been enforced since 2010, but unfortunately, remarkably, it has not been meaningfully revised even once in 15 years. The agreement to resume upgrade talks and to set a $50 billion trade target by 2030 is therefore a genuinely significant step. But the distance between that ambition and where we are today is substantial. The core problem is well known. In 2025, bilateral trade reached around $25.6 billion. But Korea's trade surplus with India hit a historical high of $12.8 billion. So from India perspective, that imbalance is politically difficult to accept, but it has made New Delhi consistently reluctant to open up further. But on Korean side, businesses repeatedly say that the actual on-the-ground benefit of the paper and current SEPA are limited by India's complex certification requirements and strict rules of origin regulations. So there's some gap between the agreement and the actual implemented on the ground. So the most fundamentally, the current SEPA simply does not cover the industries that matter most today, such as electric vehicles, semiconductors, renewable energy, AI, and digital trade. So it was designed for a very different economic era in 2010s. So, however, both leaders agreed at this summit to reflect new trade norms, including supply chains and green economy, in the upgraded agreement, and to establish a working group between the Korean embassy and the Indian regulatory authorities to better support Korean SCMS on the ground. So my assessment is that reaching $50 billion by 2030 will require a strong effort from both sides. So Korea brings to the table its world-class capabilities in shipbuilding and defense technology. And India needs to commit to SEPA reforms that actually remove the barriers Korean companies face in practice.
So an ambitious goal, but efforts would have to really follow for that. Now, before we conclude our discussion tonight, Professor Rishi, we are aware that President Lee will head to Vietnam as his next destination. How do you see Korea's role as a bridge power evolving?
Yeah, so this swing that President Lee is making to India and then to Vietnam comes after last fall's APEC summit, where obviously Lee Jae Myung had meetings with world leaders from APEC, including many who are from the global South, as well as other middle powers. Then just recently we've had summits with the President of Brazil, Prime Minister of Singapore, the French President. Now this meeting, so South Korea is clearly trying to build some of those bridges between itself and other middle powers to make up for some of the problems that we're seeing in the global multilateral organizations, and so this is a part of that larger trend. What we're going to see in Vietnam will of course deal a lot with the business connections between Vietnam and South Korea, which I mentioned earlier, are significant, in fact, larger than those between South Korea and India. But just in general, in terms of this bridging role, what I think is likely to happen is that South Korea under Lee Jae Myung is going to continue to try to build out its portfolio of middle power relationships, many-lateral relationships with other middle powers, primarily to follow its own interest. And I think if it does so in a way that's consistent and that's hooked in with the larger multilateral structure to the extent that it still remains, South Korea is going to be able to serve as a bridging function more or less naturally with global partners and the more advanced middle powers who are strategic partners and allies of South Korea.
So our role could expand well beyond the region in that sense. But I'm afraid we'll have to conclude our discussion right here. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Ritchie.
I was glad to be here. Thank you.
And of course, Professor Cho as well. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame tonight. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.